This is BBC Radio 3. The time is now 6 o'clock, and we begin a new four-part series on Jazz File. It focuses on the work of the controversial American composer and saxophonist John Zorn, a key figure in New York's downtown avant-garde music scene. The series is presented by the British improviser Steve Beresford, and it contains some strong language from the outset.
British society would never produce a Zorn. You couldn't kick up that much dust here. He happens in the one place where it could happen.
John doesn't care who he's yelling at. You know, if it's Lou Reed, he'll just tell him, man, that sounds like shit, do it this way.
John the hard bop saxophonist, John the ultra-radical free saxophonist, John the kind of post-synarchist composer, John the postmodernist assembler. There are probably at least 3 or 4 lives that John developed simultaneously.
Musicians Derek Bailey, Tim Berne and Evan Parker, all with vivid recollections of American composer-saxophonist John Zorn. For the next 4 weeks in downtown Avant-Garde, we'll be trying to fit in as much of Zorn's hugely varied sound world as we can. On the way, we'll talk to many of his associates and, of course, Zorn himself.
A lot of my life has been reacting against those fucking assholes that say you could do much better. You know what I mean? It's my parents, my tutors, my teachers, whoever it is, who's, you know, has a lot of potential, but he's not fulfilling his potential. It's like, go fuck yourself. This is who I am, this is the best I can do, and if you don't like it, drop dead.
For many years, John Zorn has lived in downtown New York, producing some of the most exciting and uncompromising music you can hear. Surprisingly, given his choice of instrument and choice of neighborhood, his route into the avant-garde was not through jazz.
I look at some of the scores that I bought, like Varese, Weber, and Ives. You know, their dates are like 1968. So that's when classical music, I guess, became vital to me. And I was 15, I guess, at that. I was born in 53, so 14 or 15. Before that, I was playing bass in a surf band, you know, improvising around on the piano and playing guitar. So around that period, 14, 15, I started writing weird little things, little operas, and it became clear that none of these things would get performed. So then I started writing for the people that were around me. My friends, whatever instruments they happened to play. They didn't play instruments, they played a door and opened and closed it, whatever it was. And I went to school in St. Louis for 1.5 years to get away from my parents. I became aware of the BAG Black Arts Group, of the AACM, of Sun Ra. That's where I really got turned on to the improvisation traditionally in free jazz. You go to record stores when you're a kid and you go, what's weird? What's out there? What's the weirdest thing you've got in the store? And I went to a store in St. Louis and the guy said, well, you got to get Feralto. We got like 20 boxes of that downstairs. Nobody wants to buy it. I said, that's the record I want. He gave me that, he gave me Cosmic Tones for Mental Therapy, Sun Ra, and he gave me Albert Eiler, Bells. And that was like, okay, I'm ready to go. That was a whole new world.
An excerpt from Zorn's 1974 home recording, Mikhail Zoetrope, and before that, Anthony Braxton's Four Alto. Zorn moved back to New York City with an even stronger passion for avant-garde music of all genres and a willingness to experiment with other musicians. In typical New York style, he took his sax and clarinet into the open air.
I played on the streets, and I'd meet people that way. Chadbourne, Polly Bradfield, Tom Cora, Toshinori Kondo. And slowly, you know, the pool of people that I could work with grew. Now, these are all improvisers. So to write every note down for an improviser is really a mistake. I mean, I learned that very early on because people would give me things to play, and I said, why am I sitting here playing this when I can improvise better than this? I was kind of surrounded by these incredible improvisers that developed a very idiosyncratic language influenced by Derek Bailey, Evan Parker, Han Benink, the European scene, as well as the AACM, Leo Smith, Anthony Braxton, Roscoe Mitchell, as well as rock music that they'd listen to, you know, when they were growing up, movie soundtracks, world music. I mean, what pulled us together was an interest in all those things. That's where we had a common ground.
Having established this common ground with a pool of improvisers, Zorn began writing a variety of pieces for them, including the so-called game pieces.
The game pieces were kind of pieces that would inspire these improvisers, that would get them excited. They could play whatever language they had, but it was put into a certain kind of a structural context. And it was one that was fun to play. It was one where everybody had kind of an equal say in controlling where the piece went, but yet at the same time, it created a sound world that I had envisioned.
All of this very new music was going on in the basement of a downtown pet store called Exotic Aquatics. Piano player Anthony Coleman.
I mean, the pet store was above, but somehow like there was leakage, and it was like there was this rug, and it was damp. And there were crickets. There were crickets wandering around. You know, it was like a really unbelievable place. And so we started playing, and he gave us a score. And each person picks out 5 gestures, and they kind of play them off each other. And then in between, they have solos, and then they have these pips where everybody comes together on like downbeat, like bip. So this whole sentence felt like, okay, you know, I get this. Okay, there's this little gestures, and this is what happens, and that's cool. And then there's solos. Solos, yeah, it's like improvising. I get it. So I started soloing. I put all my, you know, I had my little solo, and I hadn't prepared piano, and he was like, and we'd finished, and he said, great, you know, that's great, but the solo doesn't have to be like that. The solo could be just a couple of notes, or solo could be it could be nothing. You could just play behind, or it could be, doesn't have to be that active. It could be just more about the intention. And I said, well, so how, then if it's about the intention, then how do you know it's a solo? He said, well, you just know. And it's like, that's great, okay. All right. You know, and it was funny because here was something I was definitely looking for. And I realized it right away. And not that I so much, to be honest, enjoyed the sound of the thing. The sound of the thing was okay. But what was really going on was I was looking for something where the landscape was not quite as defined and not so climax-oriented. That was something I was really thinking about, but I didn't know how to do it, and it seemed like, I started to see that here was a guy that had answered a lot of the questions that I was asking.
The early game pieces were very simply done, a series of structures. You know, here's a solo, then there's a duo, then there's a trio, then there's this solo, like almost a list of different permutations of players. The first breakthrough was the piece Lacrosse. I imposed a restriction on the players to do tiny little pieces of music that are between, say, 2 and 8 seconds long. What was really impressed upon me in studying classical music was that the great masterpieces were ones where you took one note out and the piece was lessened. And I somehow wanted to bring that sensibility into an improvisational context.
In the late 1970s, guitarist Bill Frisell was virtually unknown, having played on just one recording.
Up until then, so much of what I did was based on trying to develop one small little idea over a long period of time. I mean, suddenly I'm with Zorn and you had to play some kind of complete musical statement in just a matter of seconds, you know, and do it instantly. And I'd never tried to do anything like that. And there was just this sort of electricity in the air, you know, this feeling of something new happening. And it just completely rearranged my brain cells. Yeah.
Bill Frisell was not alone in finding that Zorn's music presented new challenges, and the game pieces were constantly evolving. Lacrosse, hockey, and fencing all followed in quick succession, each using increasingly subtle sets of rules to guide the players. Then came pool and the concept of the pool downbeat.
A pool downbeat was basically a downbeat in which something changed. Anything could change. If you were playing, you could stop. If you were not playing, you could come in. If you could change your music in some way. But it was something that could happen at any time in the piece, and anybody could give this downbeat. The idea that things could change at any time was very attractive to an improviser. The fact that a downbeat could happen, and you could be playing alone, or you could be playing with 10 other people, almost made the game pieces more improvisationally unpredictable than an actual improvisation.
The series of game pieces in the 1980s culminated in Cobra, which remains one of Zorn's best known and most performed pieces.
It's basically just a series of rules, and I don't talk about sound at all. Sound was not even alluded to. It was just really a series of on and off switches. Anybody at any time could pretty much do what they wanted to do within the rules.
Radical as the game pieces were, he had also been developing solo pieces, which were considerably more rarefied. British improviser Evan Parker, one of Zorn's guiding lights, was lucky enough to witness one such performance.
John was giving concerts in his apartment on the Lower East Side, but the maximum audience was 3 for any one performance. I think you paid $10. Then you witnessed what he called the theatre of musical optics. And there was no sound, or only incidental sounds. He certainly wasn't playing the saxophone. And ushered into a dark room with the other 2 members of the audience, and the 3 of you, plus Zorn, occupied the 4 sides of a small table with a translucent top. And there were many different sources of illumination, small handheld lamps and overhead lamps, and each time the lights changed, something had changed about the table.
Objects were put out at different times, were combined in different ways. Some were just little colored cubes. Others were like I'd have 50 different objects on a grid, and I'd combine each one in different ways, going this way across the grid, and then this way across the grid, and then diagonally across, and the other way.
And it went on for a good while, and was a very special kind of performance. I've never seen anything like it before or since. And it had a lot in common with magic, except it was not quite clear what the trick was, you know.
I think what it's all about is, from a very young age, I found a connection between the visual and the oral. From watching movies all the time, from watching cartoons all the time. And as I went further and further out, going beyond Glass and Reich and minimalism, I actually even went beyond sound itself. I began to feel that music was a way of manipulating a material, and that it didn't have to be sound, that you could manipulate something visual in a musical way. And that's where the theater of musical optics came about. I always used to say to myself, I'll become more well-known as a musician making regular music, and then I'll come back to the real revolution that I created, the really advanced shit that's going to be music like 100 years from now, these visual musical performances. And who knows?
Whether Zorn's prediction is true or not, the theatre of musical optics certainly helped him develop a high degree of manipulative skill, and this ability to move objects swiftly and accurately around a small space served him well in his next, equally unlikely musical endeavour.
I'm not exactly sure what year it was that Mark Miller, the crazy percussionist who used to light his hand on fire and scream at it on stage, gave me a duck call. But he did. And it was a reed sound. And it seemed to relate in some ways to the sounds I was looking to get out of the clarinet and sax, and, you know. So I bought more. And eventually it just kept growing and growing and growing. I'd go to these hunting shops and try them out, and finally they wouldn't let me into hunting shops anymore. So I had to get a mail order, and I'd call this little woman out in the middle of, you know, Wisconsin, where Alt and Weems had their factory. She thought I was some big hunter in New York. And I'd just call and say, yeah, can you send me a pheasant, 2 pheasant calls, and and I'd get all this shit, and I spread them out on a table and use them and jump from one to the next. And of course, the cartoon thing was there. A lot of simultaneity. I was working with water, because I think I heard a Vinko Globokar record where Michel Portal was playing his bass clarinet into a bowl of water. So I kind of, well, I'll take that too. Evan Parker has taken the saxophone as far as anyone has taken it. And I went through a period of trying to emulate Evan and then moved on. And I found a way of doing it with the help of these strange little reed machines, these duck calls.
Zorn's dedication and energy in pursuit of musical innovation attracted another of his guiding lights, British guitarist Derek Bailey, who invited Zorn to tour with his group Company.
And John was virtually unknown at that time, and he wasn't playing much saxophone. He was playing like duck whistles and mouthpieces, and like spent a lot of time with his head underwater kind of thing. And he got something of a kind of battering, but he actually worked great. My impression of most saxophone playing is that it's kind of retrospective in its orientation. So most saxophone players, for instance, somehow sound associated to the 40s and 50s. And then there's another lot from the 60s, and then there's another lot from the 70s. Zorn, I think, is the only one I can think of who is totally contemporary. I think he's a very special player in that respect.
I mean, I don't even think I belong in the jazz tradition, but jazz music is really one of the great literatures of the saxophone, maybe the only real literature of the saxophone. Classical saxophone is really pretty boring. So I studied the literature of the saxophone, which was, man, you got to come to grips with Charlie Parker. You got to come to grips with, you know, Lester Young. You got to come to grips with a variety of music that I loved, but at the same time was really not my experience. was not where I was coming from. And for years, I refused to play jazz music live. And finally, friends of mine like Wayne Horvitz, who was also interested in jazz and played it on his own, said, look, why don't we, make a record?
The Sonny Clark Memorial Quartet turned out to be the first in a whole series of creative tributes. Ennio Morricone, Jean-Luc Godard, Mickey Spillane, and Ornette Coleman were all about to get the Zorn treatment.
Minor Meeting, performed by the Sonny Clark Memorial Quartet, bringing Jazz File to a close. The programme was presented by Steve Beresford and produced by Steve Shepherd. Downtown Avant-Garde, the music of John Zorn, is a Something Else production for BBC Radio 3. Well, next week, John Zorn turns his attention to his musical and cultural heroes with a string of extraordinary musical tributes. That's at the same time, 6 o'clock next Saturday. Meanwhile, you can hear more of John Zorn in performance in Jazz on 3 tonight. He plays with two of his bands, Bar Cockbar and Masada, in concerts in London. That's Jazz on 3 at 11:30 tonight.